Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're cutting through some of the noise around a really critical and fast-moving situation between the U.S. and Canada. Very close neighbors, obviously. Our focus is a pretty striking report from Global News. It's dated July 31, 2025, and the headline reads, Trump raises tariffs on Canada to 35% with no trade deal in sight.
So our mission today, we want to unpack this significant development, understand the reasons given for it, explore the different angles of this, incredibly complex relationship, all seen through the lens of this one key source, and try to figure out what it means for you.
Yeah, what's really fascinating here is how you've got these different threads all sort of coming together. Trade talks, drug policy, even international diplomacy. It's all converging very publicly. We'll try to get beyond just the surface facts in the article, help you grasp not just what happened, but maybe the deeper why it matters, how these different pieces fit together. Okay, let's get right into it then. That headline, let's unpack it and look at the immediate impact. Our source says Thursday, July 31st, President Trump signed an executive order. What exactly did that order do, and when does it actually start?
Right. So this order, it sharply increases U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods up to 35%, which is, quite a jump. And it kicks in fast midnight on Friday. The article makes pretty clear this is a direct result of a trade deal deadline that just wasn't met. And, connecting it to the bigger picture, this order isn't just about Canada. It also sets up new tariffs for a whole range of other U.S. trading partners. Those take effect in 7 days. It keeps the sort of reciprocal 10% baseline, but hits countries harder if they haven't signed new trade deals.
Okay, so it's broad but focused initially on Canada with that high rate. What about existing deals, like CSMA? Are all Canadian goods hit with this 35%?
That's a really important point. The source confirms that goods traded under CUSMA, that's the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, they will continue to be exempt. So that's still protected. But there's a really interesting, almost punitive detail in there. Goods that are deliberately transshipped, routed through other countries to try and dodge that 35% rate, they'll face an even higher tariff of 40%.
Just 40%. Wow.
Yeah.
That really signals they want to prevent any workarounds. It does raise the question, though, what's the rationale behind such a steep hike, and why right now?
Well, the White House laid out two main reasons, according to the article we're looking at. First, they said Canada has failed to cooperate in curbing the ongoing flood of fentanyl and other illicit drugs into the states. And second, they pointed directly at Canada's own retaliatory tariffs on American goods. They explicitly framed the increase from the previous 25% up to 35% as a response to Canada's continued inaction and retaliation regarding what they're calling an existing emergency.
Okay, so fentanyl and retaliation. But this fentanyl issue, it isn't completely new ground, is it? The source mentions an original 25% tariff connected to this.
Exactly. You're right. That's key context. That original 25% tariff, it was brought in using an emergency provision specifically tied to the fentanyl epidemic. And that older order, while it's actually been facing legal challenges, the U.S. Court of International Trade even suspended those tariffs briefly earlier this year. They ruled Trump had overstepped his authority. And get this, a U.S. appeals court was hearing arguments on that very case on the same Thursday this new order was signed.
So the legal ground is already shaky, or at least contested. That really adds a wrinkle. Let's dig into that fentanyl claim more since it's so central. What does the source say about the specifics? U.S. concerns versus what Canada says it's doing, and the actual data.
Right. The article notes President Trump has been saying for a while that Canada isn't doing enough on fentanyl crossing the border, but it also lays out Canada's side, or at least actions they've taken. Things like boosting border security, appointing a specific fentanyl czar, and more police drug busts happening recently. But here's where the data gets really, really interesting. If you look at the annual drug seizure stats from U.S. Customs and Border Protection CBP, they paint a very different picture. Those official U.S. stats show fentanyl from Canada makes up only about 1% of all fentanyl seized at U.S. borders. The overwhelming majority, according to CBP, comes from Mexico.
1%. That's a huge difference from the way it's being framed as a primary justification, isn't it?
Yeah.
So how does the White House square that low number with their statement about seizures?
Well, this is where you see how data can be framed, right? The White House statement, while acknowledging the overall low percentage, isn't really highlighted. Instead, focuses on a recent surge, specifically at the northern border. They pointed to April and May, where seizures jumped to 11 and 14 kilograms respectively, before dropping back to 1 kilo last month. And their key claim is that seizures at the northern border this fiscal year have already surpassed total seizures of the past 3 years combined. They use this to emphasize Canada's, quote, escalating role. And they add that dramatic kicker that the amount seized could have killed more than 16 million Americans. So they shift focus from overall volume to recent spikes and potential lethality. Then the article adds that Canada's own retaliatory tariffs, quote, further complicate bilateral efforts to address this escalating drug crisis, basically implying Canada's actions are part of the problem.
Okay, so it's a selective use of data to build a narrative around an emergency. That makes sense in terms of justification. Now, beyond fentanyl and retaliation, the source hints there are other older issues Trump has with Canada. What are those?
Yeah, the article mentions a couple of long-running ones. Trump has repeatedly complained about Canada's supply management system, especially for dairy. That's been a trade irritant for a long time. And the other one is military spending. He's quoted saying, they have to pay a fair rate, wanting fairness for our country. This echoes his long-standing calls for NATO allies, including Canada, to increase defense spending. These are definitely not new points of friction.
Right, those sound familiar.
Yeah.
So with all this going on, the new tariffs, the justifications, the old grievances, where do the actual Canada-U.S. trade talks stand?
Well, the source says Canada's trade minister, Dominic LeBlanc, was actually in Washington this week for talks. But his office didn't offer any updates. Same from the Prime Minister's office, no comment on whether Prime Minister Mark Carney has reached out to Trump directly. And interestingly, Canadian officials themselves had apparently been trying to temper expectations before Trump's deadline even hit. Prime Minister Carney is quoted saying, "We're seeking the best deal for Canadians. We have not yet reached that deal. Negotiations will continue until we do." And he acknowledged it was possible talks might not wrap up by August 1st. So they seem prepared for this impasse, perhaps.
Okay, so the talks were already looking tough. But then, just when things seemed complicated enough, our source throws in another element, something that seems to have come almost out of the blue in the context of these trade talks.
Yeah, this was a real geopolitical curveball. Just before the tariff hike, Prime Minister Carney announced Canada intends to recognize a Palestinian state by September. Now, this was predicated on certain democratic reforms happening first, but still a major foreign policy announcement. And it immediately raises that question, how do these big diplomatic stances suddenly play into trade negotiations?
Wow. Okay, so how did President Trump react to that, especially with trade talks already so tense?
Well, initially, on Thursday morning, before the order was signed, the source says Trump escalated the situation. He said Canada's decision on Palestinian statehood would make reaching a trade deal very hard, directly linking the two. But then, later in the day, he apparently backtracked a bit, or at least nuanced it. He clarified the statement was not a deal breaker. But then, when asked specifically about the talks, he just said, "We'll see." Which, leaves things pretty ambiguous. It could be seen as softening or just keeping another pressure point active.
Okay, so putting all these pieces together, what's the takeaway? We have a big tariff hike officially blamed on fentanyl and Canadian retaliation, but it's layered over older complaints about dairy and defense spending. And then this unexpected diplomatic move by Canada regarding Palestinian statehood gets thrown into the mix, making the already tough trade negotiations even more uncertain.
Exactly. I think if you connect it all, this deep dive really shows that these bilateral relationships, they're almost never about just one single thing, are they? It's always this delicate, kind of intricate balancing act. You've got economics, security concerns, domestic politics, diplomatic signaling, all tangled together. And this article really highlights how fast things can shift. You have deadlines, different ways of reading the same data, competing priorities. It all plays a role in this strategic dance.
Yeah, for you, the listener, I think this whole situation just underscores how important it is to look at international disputes from multiple angles. It's rarely just about the headline issue. There's usually a whole web of factors involved.
Which maybe leads to a question for you to think about. In this world where everything seems so interconnected, diplomacy affects trade, health crises get linked to tariffs, how do countries actually manage that balancing act? How do they juggle their own domestic needs and political stories with the need for stable, predictable relationships, especially with their closest neighbors? Where does the rhetoric end and the policy reality begin?
That's a great question to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration gives you a clearer, maybe more nuanced view of what's happening in this really critical U.S.-Canada relationship right now. Until next time, keep digging for those insights.